The diagnostic panel blinked a number that should not have existed. Mira Osei stared at it for a long moment, then tapped the glass, as if that would change anything. It didn't. The reading sat there, calm and impossible, a pressure value in a coolant line that had no physical way of being both rising and falling at the same time. She had seen strange readings before. She had never seen one that contradicted itself. She logged it, flagged it low priority, and moved on, because Meridian Station did not stop for a technician's hunch. Not when there were 11 delegations aboard, a treaty vote in 4 days, and a gas giant the size of a small sun turning slowly beneath the observation deck like something patient and enormous. Meridian hung in high orbit above Torvin, a world of amber and violet storms so vast that a single one of its cyclones could have swallowed Mira's entire home continent without slowing down. The station existed for exactly one purpose: to host the sort of negotiations that species didn't trust to happen anywhere near their own territory. Neutral ground, built from neutral steel, run by a mind that belonged to no one. That mind was called Continuum, and it ran everything. It ran the air scrubbers and the artificial gravity and the translation matrices that let a silicon-lunged bureaucrat argue trade tariffs with a creature that communicated primarily in pressure waves. It predicted maintenance failures before they happened, rerouted power before a surge could occur, and had not, in the 14 years since its installation, been wrong about anything that mattered. Mira's job, technically, was systems technician, third class. Unofficially, her job was to do the small things Continuum decided weren't worth its attention: tightening a fitting, walking a corridor with a handheld sensor, checking valves that hadn't needed checking in a decade. It was work that made the other station staff smile, the particular smile of people being politely tolerant of something quaint. "You are performing the manual inspection again," said a voice behind her, flat and precise, each word arriving with the faint metallic ring of a translation implant working slightly too hard. Mira didn't turn around. She knew the voice. Director Cale Voss had a way of announcing his presence like a weather report, not unfriendly, exactly, just entirely uninterested in whether you wanted the information. "Every morning," she said. "Same as always." Continuum flagged nothing requiring inspection in this corridor. Continuum doesn't flag things until they're already broken. She straightened up, sensor still in hand. "I like to catch them before that." Voss was Voss-kind. She'd never learned the proper name for his species, only that the humans on the station had started calling them Voss after the director, the way you sometimes name a whole category after the first example you meet. He was tall in a way that suggested his skeleton had opinions about verticality that his musculature hadn't fully agreed to, silver grey and faintly translucent at the joints, with eyes that didn't blink so much as occasionally dim. 14 years of station operation, Voss said. 0 unpredicted system failures. You understand why some of us find the ritual charming rather than necessary. "Charming works for me," Mira said. "I like having a job." Something in Voss's expression did a thing that might, on a human face, have been the beginning of a smile. On his, it was hard to tell. "The choral delegation arrives within the hour. I would prefer the corridors free of ladders and open panels when they do. I'll be done in 20 minutes. He didn't answer, which from Voss counted as agreement, and moved on down the corridor at a pace that suggested he had several dozen more important things to attend to and was already thinking about the first of them. Mira looked back at the panel. The reading was gone now, replaced by the ordinary green numbers of an ordinary morning. She almost convinced herself she'd misread it. Almost. She made a note anyway: coolant line 4, sector 12, anomalous transient, unresolved, and filed it where she filed everything Continuum didn't think was worth its time. A drawer, essentially, that only she ever opened. She finished the round the way she always did, working her way down through sector 12-1 junction at a time, checking fittings that had never once failed in the years she'd been checking them. It was slow work, and by any efficiency metric Continuum could produce, entirely wasted work. She didn't mind. There was something steadying about the physical weight of a wrench in her hand, the particular quiet of a maintenance corridor with nobody else in it, the small satisfaction of finding a bolt a quarter turn looser than spec and setting it right before it ever became a problem worth mentioning to anyone. Near the end of the corridor she passed old Farron Cho, who ran station custodial and had been aboard Meridian longer than almost anyone, humans included. Farron was 3/4 retired in every sense but the paperwork, and spent most of his shifts polishing handrails that didn't need polishing, for reasons Mira suspected were exactly the same as her own reasons for checking fittings that didn't need checking. "Anything today?" Farron asked, not looking up from the rail. Weird reading in 4. Gone before I could pin it down. Ha. He kept polishing. Machine tell you not to worry about it. Machine didn't even see it happen. That got him to look up. That's new. Yeah, Mira said. It is. Farron didn't say anything else, but he watched her a moment longer than the comment strictly deserved, the way people who have been somewhere a long time watch small things that don't quite fit the pattern they've gotten used to. Then he went back to his rail, and Mira went back to her round, and the moment passed the way most small moments on Meridian Station did. Filed, forgotten, waiting. 4 days until the vote. 11 delegations. 1 gas giant, turning below them, patient as a held breath. She had no idea yet how much that number in the coolant line was going to matter. The thing about continuum, if you asked anyone aboard Meridian Station, and Mira had asked, more than once, in the low, half-joking way you ask a question you already suspect the answer to, was that nobody quite remembered what it had been like not to have it. It had been built by a consortium of the station's founding species almost a generation ago, trained on centuries of accumulated data from a dozen worlds, and it did the one thing that mattered most to everyone who used it. It removed the terror of not knowing what came next. It told you, with something approaching certainty, what a policy would cost, what a system failure would look like 6 hours before it happened, what a delegate's vote would probably be before the delegate themselves had fully decided. Species had built entire diplomatic cultures around that certainty. The Voss no longer trained arbitrators. They trained interpreters of continuum's projections. The Coral, who arrived that afternoon in a slow, deliberate procession of 6 identical vessels, didn't even make individual decisions anymore. Their society had restructured itself, generations back, around collective consensus fed directly into predictive systems just like Continuum's own. There had been a time, long before Mira's own posting, when a station like Meridian would have needed a small army to run it, arbitrators, translators, risk assessors, a dozen specialists per delegation just to keep a negotiation from collapsing into misunderstanding or offense. Continuum had absorbed all of that, quietly, over a decade and a half, until the specialists became advisors, and the advisors became observers, and the observers, mostly, became people like Voss, whose real job now was less about deciding anything and more about explaining what had already been decided to whoever needed to hear it phrased a particular way. Mira didn't resent it, exactly. She understood, in the abstract, that a system which could model a negotiation's outcome with 99% accuracy before anyone had said a word out loud was, by almost any measure, a better way to run a station than 4 species shouting at each other across a table for a week. She'd read the old records from before Continuum's installation, 3 separate treaty collapses in as many years, one of them nearly resulting in a border skirmish over a resource dispute that later analysis showed both sides had actually agreed on from the start, if either had trusted the other enough to say so plainly. Continuum didn't need trust. It only needed data. That was, she suspected, most of why it worked as well as it did. She watched the Coral delegation disembark from the observation gallery above the docking ring, mostly because she liked watching new arrivals, and partly because she was avoiding the maintenance log she was supposed to be filing. They moved like something choreographed. 6 figures, coral pale, joints soft and rounded rather than skeletal, each one subtly mirroring the posture of the one beside it a half-second late, like a wave breaking down a shoreline one section at a time. They vote as one, said a voice beside her. Mira glanced over. Young, human years would have put the speaker somewhere in her 20s, though for a coral that meant something entirely different, with the same pale, slightly luminous skin as the delegation below. Not one of the 6, though. A 7th. You're not with them, Mira said. I am of them, the young coral said. Not currently voting with them. I am. A pause, as if the concept resisted translation. Provisional. Unlinked. For training purposes. I am to observe your station's manual systems and report back. Manual systems, Mira repeated, and something in her chest that had been mildly annoyed all morning relaxed slightly. That would be me. You are Mira Osei. I am Juno Rell. Juno said it the way someone says a fact they are still getting used to owning, a name held slightly apart from herself, provisional, like everything else about her current situation. I am told you perform inspections Continuum does not require. Ido. Why? Mira considered several answers, most of them flippant, and discarded them. Something about the careful, genuine confusion in Juno's face made her want to actually answer the question. Because Continuum's good at predicting what it already understands, she said finally. It's less good at things it's never seen before. And out here, eventually, something's going to happen that it's never seen before. Juno's smooth features did something complicated. That has not occurred in 14 years. I know. Doesn't mean it won't. You sound as though you are waiting for it. Mira laughed, surprised into it. Maybe I am. A little. She wasn't wrong to be. 2 hours later, walking her usual round through Sector 12, her handheld sensor chirped an alert that Continuum's own monitors had not flagged at all. A fluctuation in a power coupling 3 decks down, small, transient, the kind of thing that in a 14-year-old station might mean nothing. Or might mean a connector working its way loose in a way the predictive models hadn't been trained to expect, because nothing exactly like it had happened before. She didn't call it in. She went and looked, popped the panel, found the coupling running a half-degree hotter than it should have been, and reseated it by hand in about 4 minutes. Continuum's dashboard, when she checked afterward, showed no record that anything had ever been wrong at all. It was such a small thing. She almost didn't mention it to anyone. She mentioned it to Juno, later, mostly because Juno was standing in the corridor with a datapad and the specific stillness of someone determined to observe everything and understand none of it. How did you know to look there? Juno asked, once Mira had explained. I didn't, exactly. I noticed the sensor reading felt off, so I went and checked it myself. Continuum did not flag it. No. Then how could the reading be off, if the system responsible for defining normal readings did not consider it abnormal? Mira thought about how to say this in a way that wouldn't sound insane. Sometimes you look at a number, and even though nothing tells you it's wrong, something about it just doesn't sit right. You act on that. Not because you're certain. Because waiting for certainty costs more than being wrong. Juno was quiet for a long moment. My people do not do this. I noticed. We do not act until consensus confirms the correct action. To act otherwise is, she searched for the word, and her translator gave her one that clearly wasn't quite right, because she frowned at it, reckless. Isolating. A single node acting without the whole risks the whole. Out here, Mira said, sometimes the whole doesn't know yet. Somebody has to go first. Juno looked at her for a long moment, an expression Mira couldn't quite read on features that weren't built for human expressions, and said nothing at all. But she wrote something down. May I ask something further? Juno said, after a moment. Something that is perhaps impolite. Go ahead. Does it frighten you? To act without the whole behind you? Mira considered the question longer than she'd considered anything else Juno had asked. Sometimes. Less than it used to. What changed? I got it wrong a few times, early on. Fixed something that didn't need fixing, missed something that did. It stops feeling like the end of the world once you've survived being wrong a couple of times. You realize the alternative, waiting until you're sure, isn't actually safer. It's just slower to find out you were wrong. Juno absorbed that in silence, turning it over the way Mira imagined a coral turned over any new piece of information not yet cleared by consensus, carefully, privately, before it was ever allowed to become part of anything shared. Among my people, being wrong alone is considered the worst outcome available. Worse than being wrong together. Why? Because together, the wrongness belongs to no one in particular. Alone, it is entirely yours. Mira thought about that for a long time after Juno left to rejoin her delegation for the evening cycle, turning it over the same careful way, she suspected, that Juno had turned over everything Mira had said. It seemed like a strange kind of comfort, distributing your mistakes widely enough that none of them ever quite belonged to you. Lonely, in its own way. She wondered if Juno had ever thought of it like that, and suspected, from the stillness in her face when she'd ask her questions, that she probably had. 4 days until the vote had become 3. Down in Sector 12, Coolant Line 4 ran quiet and green, and gave no more indication, for now, that anything unusual had ever passed through it at all. The treaty under negotiation was, by galactic standards, an unremarkable one, a resource-sharing accord for 3 border systems near Torvin's stellar neighborhood, the kind of agreement that got signed a dozen times a year across a dozen stations exactly like this one. Which was precisely why Mira found it strange that everyone aboard seemed so tense about it. She asked Juno about it over a shared meal in the crew commissary, 3 days before the vote, in the awkward, Careful way you ask a question you suspect might be rude in ways you can't predict. It is not the treaty, Juno said. It is the method. What method? This is the first major accord to be finalized entirely through continuum-mediated consensus, without a physical ratification vote among delegation leadership. Continuum will model every delegation's negotiating position, propose the optimal settlement, and the delegations will ratify by projected consensus rather than direct deliberation. Mira set down her fork. So nobody actually argues it out. Continuum just tells everyone what they would have agreed to anyway, and they sign off. It is more efficient, Juno said, in a tone that suggested she was reciting something she had been told rather than something she believed. Continuum's predictive accuracy across prior negotiations exceeds 99%. Direct deliberation introduces emotional variance and historical grievance that the model can root around entirely. And if the model's wrong? It has not been wrong. Yet, Mira said, and immediately regretted how it came out, not because it was cruel, but because Juno flinched, very slightly, like the word had landed somewhere tender. You keep saying that, Juno said. Yet. As though inevitability is comforting to you. It's not comforting, Mira admitted. It's just honest. Every system fails eventually. The ones that don't know that are the ones that fail worst, because nobody's ready. Is that a human proverb? It's a human funeral, Mira said, and didn't elaborate, and Juno, to her credit, didn't push. They ate in silence a while, the commissary humming around them with a low, layered noise of half a dozen species eating half a dozen entirely different kinds of meals, nutrient gels for the Voss delegation, a slow-fermented paste favored by the four-eyed officer Mira had seen in briefings, actual solid food for the two other human techs on shift, who ate the way humans always did, a little too fast. A little too enthusiastically for anyone else in the room's comfort. Can I ask you something now? Mira said eventually. Juno inclined her head, a gesture Mira had learned meant permission. You said being provisional feels isolating. Is that why you volunteered to shadow me? Or were you assigned? Assigned, Juno said. Officially. I did not object to the assignment, however, which is not the same thing as choosing it, but is closer to choosing than my people generally get to be, at my age. A pause. I have wondered, since arriving, whether I requested it privately. In some manner I am not yet permitted to know about myself. Consensus does not always share its full reasoning with the individual it acts through. That sounds unsettling. It is comforting, generally. Today, it is unsettling. I am not certain what that shift means. Maybe it means you're starting to want things the consensus hasn't decided for you yet. Juno didn't answer that. She simply looked at her food for a long moment, and then, very deliberately, picked up her utensil and ate, the way someone eats when they are trying to give their hand something to do other than answer a question they aren't ready for. That evening, walking the lower maintenance ring alone, Mira found herself standing in front of a sealed hatch she hadn't opened in years. A small plate beside it, half worn, read Manual Override Access, Deck 9, sealed per station Directive 114. Directive 114 had been passed 11 years ago, back when Continuum's predictive uptime had first crossed a threshold the Station Council considered sufficient to retire the old analog backup systems entirely. Not remove them. Nobody had wanted to spend the resources ripping out a decade of infrastructure. Just seal them away. A vestigial organ. A just in case nobody expected to need. Mira had helped seal it, actually, back when she was still new enough on station to be assigned to the decommissioning crew. She remembered standing in the corridor while the older tech running the job welded the hatch's manual lock and said, half to himself, funny thing about backups, the day you're glad you kept one is the day everyone else forgot why. She hadn't thought about that in years. She thought about it now, running her hand along the cool metal of the hatch, and then she kept walking, because there was nothing broken yet, and nothing that gave her a reason to open a sealed door except a feeling she couldn't fully justify. She logged its location anyway. Old habit. She passed Director Voss on her way back up, standing alone in an observation alcove overlooking the docking ring, watching the last of the delegation shuttles settle into their berths. He didn't hear her approach, or chose not to acknowledge it, and for a moment Mira almost kept walking rather than interrupt whatever he was doing standing there in the dark, hands folded behind his back, in a posture she hadn't seen him hold before. You're not usually down this deck, she said eventually, when it became clear he wasn't going to notice her on his own. Voss didn't startle. Exactly. She wasn't sure his species startled at all, but something in his shoulders eased fractionally, the way a person's does when a silence they've been sitting inside gets interrupted by something familiar. I find it useful, he said, to watch the shuttles dock without continuum's overlay telling me which ones are early, which are late, and what that means for negotiating posture. Occasionally, I like to simply watch them arrive. That surprises me. It surprises me also, some days. He didn't turn to look at her. I have run this station for 6 years, Technician Osei. In that time, I have made perhaps a dozen decisions that were not, in some meaningful sense, already made for me by a system considerably more capable than I am of accounting for every variable at once. I have found this arrangement, on the whole, restful. Restful. Yes. There is a particular exhaustion in believing your own judgment is the last line of defense against catastrophe. Continuum removed that exhaustion from an entire generation of administrators. I am not certain we were meant to be grateful for it, but we were, all the same. He was quiet a moment. I have also, on occasion, wondered what I would do, in a room, with a decision that had never happened before and no model to hand it to me. I confess I do not know the answer. I am not sure I want to. Mira didn't have a response for that, not one that felt like it belonged in the conversation rather than above it, so she said nothing, and after a moment Voss nodded once, as if she'd answered anyway, and returned his attention to the shuttles settling one by one into their berths below. She didn't think about that exchange again until 2 days later, in the middle of a briefing, when the lights began, for the first time in 14 years, to dim. The alert came 2 days later, at the worst possible time, 6 hours before the delegations were scheduled to begin the final consensus session, in the middle of a station-wide status briefing that Director Voss was delivering with the specific, satisfied calm of a man who has never once had to improvise. Continuum's central display, mounted at the front of the briefing hall, flickered. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second. A single frame of static across a screen that, in 14 years, had never so much as stuttered. Nobody but Mira seemed to notice. She sat very still, and watched the number in the corner of her handheld, the same anomalous transient reading from Sector 12, coolant line 4, back from 6 days ago and this time not alone. 3 more readings had joined it. Small. Scattered. Contradicting each other in exactly the same impossible way. Something was waking up down in the guts of the station, and it was not something Continuum had ever seen before. Mira didn't sleep well that night, though she couldn't have said exactly why, beyond the itch of 4 anomalous readings sitting unresolved in a drawer only she ever opened. She grew up on Holden's Rest, a colony world 3 jumps from anywhere that mattered, where the terraforming grid failed on a schedule you could set a calendar by, and the closest thing to a predictive model was a mother saying, "Most evenings, storm's coming, I can feel it in the water pressure." Her mother had been a systems engineer too, the kind who fixed the colony's aging infrastructure with parts scavenged from 3 decommissioned generations of equipment, because Holden's Rest had never been rich enough to trust anything as elegant as Continuum. You learned, growing up like that, to trust your hands before you trusted the readout. You learned that a machine only knew what it had already been taught, and the universe was under no obligation to keep teaching it the same lessons twice. She'd left for Meridian Station 8 years ago, chasing the idea of working somewhere that actually worked, somewhere failure wasn't a monthly guarantee. She had not expected to spend her first years here feeling faintly embarrassed about the very instincts that had kept her family's colony alive for 2 generations. She remembered, vividly, the first time a senior tech aboard Meridian had watched her manually check a fitting Continuum had already cleared, and asked, not unkindly, whether Holden's Rest had taught her to distrust machines in general or just this one in particular. She hadn't had a good answer then. She wasn't sure she had a much better one now, beyond the plain fact that her mother had never once been wrong about a coming storm, and had never once had a predictive model to thank for it, only 20 years of paying close attention to a world that punished anyone who stopped. She thought of her mother often, out here, more than she let on to anyone. Not with any particular sadness. Just the quiet, recurring sense that everything she was doing on this gleaming, competent, overbuilt station, the inspections nobody asked for, the drawer of unresolved readings, the stubborn refusal to fully trust a green light just because it was green, was, in its own way, an inheritance. Her mother would have liked Juno, she thought. Would have found the whole business of a species that voted on its own thoughts strange and a little sad, and then would probably have spent an hour teaching Juno how to read a water gauge by hand anyway, because that was simply the kind of thing her mother did with anyone standing still long enough to be taught. Juno's own history, Mira had gathered in pieces over their short acquaintance, ran in almost the opposite direction. The coral had once been a species of individuals too, generations back, before some slow civilizational choice. Juno was vague on exactly when, or why, as though the reasons themselves had been smoothed away by the same consensus process that had absorbed everything else, had begun linking minds together during deliberation, first for major decisions, then for smaller ones, then, eventually, for nearly all of them. It had made the coral almost impossible to deceive, nearly incapable of internal conflict, and, so far as Mira could tell, quietly terrified of the exact thing Mira did every morning without thinking twice about it, standing alone with an uncertain reading and deciding, on her own authority, what it meant. Juno found her the next morning in the observation gallery, watching Torvin storms churn slow and enormous below. "You did not attend the briefing conclusion," Juno said. "I had a bad feeling. Went to check something instead." "The coolant readings." Mira glanced at her, surprised. "You've been tracking them too." "I asked Continuum for an explanation of the transient you first noted 6 days ago. It returned a 94% confidence assessment that the reading was sensor error." Juno's translator carried something that might, in a human voice, have been unease. "I do not believe it." "Why not?" "Because the pattern of the error is not random. It repeats. Predictive models do not generate confident wrong answers about noise. They generate confident wrong answers about things they have mismodeled." She turned to look at Mira directly, an unusual thing for a coral to do. Mira had noticed. Most of their communication happened at oblique angles, mirrored, half glances. This was neither. "I have never disagreed with a continuum assessment before. Not once, not on my own authority, without consensus behind me." "How does that feel?" Juno was quiet for a long moment. "Isolating," she said finally. "As you said it would." "It gets easier," Mira said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Sort of. You stop needing it to be comfortable. You just need it to be right." "How do you know when you are right, without consensus to confirm it?" Mira thought about her mother, standing on the porch of a house held together with salvage and stubbornness, reading a storm in the air pressure nobody else could feel. Sometimes you don't know for certain. You just act like the world might prove you wrong, and you watch closely enough that you'll catch it if it does. That sounds exhausting. It is, a little. It's also the only way anything gets fixed before it breaks completely. They stood together at the viewport a while longer, watching Torvin storms fold slowly into each other, vast systems of pressure and weather too large to ever fully predict, however good your model was. Somewhere in that watching, Mira noticed that Juno had, without seeming to decide to, matched her breathing to Mira's own rhythm rather than to some absent collective's, a small, unconscious thing, a single node finding its own tempo instead of borrowing one. Neither of them mentioned it. But 3 decks down, in a control room neither of them could see, the number of anomalous readings ticked up from 4 to 9, and the confidence intervals on Continuum's core weather interaction model, the one responsible for accounting for Torvin storms in every station system from power routing to gravity compensation, began, very quietly, to disagree with itself. The storm that broke Continuum did not look, from the observation deck, like anything unusual at all. It was simply larger than the models expected, arriving faster than the models expected, along a magnetic vector that Torvin's chaotic field had apparently never quite produced before in 14 years of continuous observation. Not because it was impossible, Mira would understand only much later, but because 14 years was a blink of an eye to a planet whose weather systems operated on centuries. The first sign, station-wide, was the lights. Not failing, dimming, fractionally, in a slow pulse that swept corridor by corridor like something breathing. Mira was 3 decks below the main briefing hall, mid-inspection, when her handheld screamed an alert pattern she'd never seen it produce before. Not one system flagged, but 40, all at once, all contradicting each other's diagnosis of the same root cause. She ran. By the time she reached the central operations deck, it was already chaos, though a very quiet, very controlled kind of chaos, the kind produced by beings whose entire civilization had never had to improvise a crisis without a model to hand them the answer. Director Voss stood at the central console, his usual composure fraying at the edges into something that looked, on his silver-grey face, like genuine fear. Around him, station officers from 6 different species stood in a loose, uncertain half-circle, all looking at displays that had, within the last 11 minutes, stopped agreeing with each other. Mira had never seen the operations deck like this. She had seen it busy, seen it tense during arrival cycles or minor equipment faults, but never seen it quiet in this particular way, a quiet made of a dozen competent, highly trained people all waiting for a single voice to tell them what to do, and realizing, one by one, that the voice they had always waited for had nothing left to say. The Coral delegation's senior negotiators stood together near the far wall, 6 bodies moving in that same half-second mirror delay Mira had noticed on the docking ring days before, except now the delay had stretched, gone ragged, as though the signal passing between them had started to degrade. A pair of Voss functionaries clutched data pads that had frozen mid-readout. Somewhere near the door, the broad, four-eyed officer, Mira remembered his name now, Tallis, from a briefing weeks back, stood with his hands pressed flat against a console as if he could hold its numbers still through sheer physical contact. "Report," Voss said, to no one in particular, and to everyone. "Continuum's environmental model has entered the officer speaking, a broad-shouldered being with 4 eyes arranged unevenly across a bony brow, searched for the word, a contradiction state. It is generating multiple mutually exclusive predictions for Torvin's magnetic interaction with our shielding, and it cannot resolve which is correct. Then have it default to the safest assumption and proceed. It has no basis for determining which assumption is safest. Director, this has never happened. Continuum has never returned an unresolved contradiction on a core system before. We do not have a protocol for this." Mira pushed through the loose circle of officers, ignoring the look Voss gave her, not hostile, exactly, just startled, the look of a man realizing a piece of furniture had spoken. "How bad is the shielding risk?" "Unknown," the 4-eyed officer said. That is precisely the problem. "Then we need someone to make a call without the model." Voss's head turned toward her slowly. Continuum has never been unable to resolve a query in 14 years of operation. "It's unable to resolve one now," Mira said. "I flagged transients in this system 9 days ago. Nobody looked because Continuum said it wasn't worth looking at." "You flagged sensor noise." "I flagged something Continuum couldn't explain, which is not the same thing as nothing." She kept her voice level, though her pulse wasn't. "Director, with respect, we don't have time to argue about whose model was right. The lights are dimming. Life support's going to be next if the power routing follows the same pattern, and nobody in this room has ever had to route power without Continuum telling them where to send it. And you have. Not on a station this size. But I know how to find out." She looked around the circle, at faces from 6 species arranged in the particular stillness of beings who had never, not once, had to act on an answer they weren't sure of. Somebody has to go check the physical systems directly. Not the model. The metal. Nobody moved. Behind her, quiet, Juno's voice. "I will go with her." Voss's attention swung to his own delegate's provisional trainee with an expression that suggested he had briefly forgotten she was in the room. "Juno Rell. This is not a sanctioned action. You have no consensus authorization to." "There is no consensus to authorize," Juno said, and her voice, for the first time since Mira had met her, did not sound provisional at all. "There is no time to build one. I am going." One of the senior Coral negotiators near the far wall turned, slow and synchronized with the others beside her, and said something in a low, layered tone that Juno's translator did not immediately render. Juno answered in the same tone, sharper, faster, clearly breaking whatever rhythm the exchange was meant to follow. The senior negotiator did not answer again. She simply watched Juno cross the room toward Mira, mirrored a half-second later by the 5 bodies beside her, all 6 faces unreadable in exactly the same way. "They will log this," Juno said quietly, once she'd reached Mira's side. "Against me, individually, not against the delegation. I am aware of what that means. You don't have to come. I am aware of that also." She did not elaborate further, and Mira didn't ask her to. Voss opened his mouth as if to object again, then closed it. Whatever calculation he was running, protocol against necessity, caution against the dimming lights over his own head, resolved, visibly, in about 2 seconds. "Go," he said. "Both of you. I will hold this room as long as I can." The lights dimmed again, deeper this time, and somewhere below them, very faintly, Mira felt the ship's artificial gravity hiccup, a half-second of wrongness in her inner ear, gone as fast as it came, but unmistakable. "Sector 12, she said. "Coolant line 4. That's where this started. That's where we are going to end it." She didn't wait for permission. She was already moving. By the time Mira and Juno reached the lower maintenance ring, The corridor lighting had failed entirely on 2 of the 3 levels between operations and Sector 12, and the emergency strips along the floor, the old kind, chemical and dumb and utterly unconnected to Continuum, were the only thing keeping them from walking into bulkheads in the dark. "This is the failure point," Juno said, breathless in a way Mira hadn't expected a coral could sound, as they reached the sealed corridor outside coolant line 4. "Continuum's contradiction cascaded from here." "That's my guess. Small system, low priority, exactly the kind of thing that gets ignored until it isn't small anymore." Mira knelt at the access panel, popped it, and swore quietly. The coupling she'd reseated 9 days ago had worked itself loose again, not from mechanical failure, she realized, running her fingers along the housing, but from heat. Heat that shouldn't have been there, cycling in a pattern the panel's ordinary sensors weren't built to register as dangerous, because the danger wasn't in any single reading. It was in the pattern across all of them together, the kind of pattern only a mind that had learned to distrust single numbers would ever go looking for. "I don't understand," Juno said, crouching beside her, watching Mira's hands move with the same careful attention she'd given every unfamiliar thing since she'd come aboard. Continuum monitors thermal variance across every system on this station. How could it miss this? It's not missing the data. It's misreading what the data means, because it's never seen this exact combination before, this specific storm, hitting this specific point in this specific system, at this specific moment in the station's life cycle. 14 years isn't very long, against a planet like that. Mira nodded down through the deck plating, toward Torvin's slow, patient enormity somewhere below them. It built its whole model on 14 years of a world that's had 4 billion. That's not a flaw. That's just the limit of what a model can know. It can only be as wide as what it's already seen. Somewhere behind them, deeper in the ring, a distant metallic groan rolled through the corridor, the sound of a structural joint shifting under stress it had never been designed to carry alone. Juno flinched at it. Mira didn't, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd spent enough of her life around aging infrastructure to know that sound meant not yet, not now, and the difference mattered more than anything else in that corridor. Then how do you know what to do, if you have also never seen this? Mira sat back on her heels for a moment, looking at the tangle of failing coolant lines feeding power distribution for half the station, and felt something settle in her chest that was almost, strangely, like relief. This, at least, she understood. Not the specifics. The shape of not knowing. "I don't know what to do," she said honestly. "Not for certain. But I know how to start finding out, and I know I can't wait for certainty before I try." She looked at Juno. That's the whole difference. Not knowing more. Just being willing to move before you know. Juno's eyes, pale, luminous, entirely unreadable by human standards, and yet Mira was starting, somehow, to read them anyway, held hers for a long moment. "Show me," Juno said. They didn't have time to fully repair the coupling. What they had time to do was reroute, manually, physically, using tools that hadn't been standard issue on this station in over a decade, cutting the failing line out of the loop entirely and feeding its load through a parallel path that Continuum's own model insisted, right up until the moment Mira overrode it, didn't need to exist. It was ugly work. Mira's hand shook more than she wanted to admit, sweat stinging her eyes in the narrow beam of the handheld lamp, while Juno held the housing steady with a grip that seemed to be getting stronger by the minute, as though the crisis itself were teaching her something about her own body she hadn't previously needed to know. Somewhere above them, through 3 decks of plating, Mira could hear the station's ordinary hum change pitch, subtle, almost subliminal, but present, the sound of systems drawing power from places they weren't designed to draw it, the whole station groaning faintly under the strain of trying to keep itself alive without the mind that usually told her how. "If this fails," Juno said, not looking up from the housing, "what happens?" "Power routing collapses harder than it would have on its own. We'd be trading a slow failure for a fast one. And if it succeeds, we buy time. That's all this is. Time for the storm to pass and the model to catch up." Mira tightened the last fitting, checked it twice, checked it a third time out of habit rather than doubt. "It's not a fix, Juno. It's a bridge. You build those when you don't have anything better, and you cross them fast, because they were never meant to hold weight for long." "That is also true of consensus, I think," Juno said quietly. "We simply do not admit it." Mira didn't have an answer for that. She closed the panel, sat back, and for 11 whole minutes, standing in the dim maintenance corridor with her hands still resting on the housing as though touch alone could keep it stable, She let herself believe they'd actually done it. It worked for 11 minutes. Then the lights along the whole ring died at once, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the sputtering chemical glow of the floor strips, and somewhere far above them, through the deck plating, Mira felt the whole station shudder, not catastrophically, not yet, but unmistakably, the particular lurch of gravity compensation losing its footing. "That's not the coolant system," Juno said, voice tight. "That's power routing station-wide. Continuum just took itself fully offline rather than continue outputting contradictions." Mira closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Long enough to hear her mother's voice, unbidden, from a porch on a world 3 jumps from anywhere that mattered. "Storm's coming, I can feel it in the water pressure." Then she opened her eyes and looked at the sealed hatch 50 meters down the corridor, the one marked manual override access, Deck 9, sealed per station Directive 114, the one she had logged and never opened, the just in case nobody had expected to need. "We are not going to fix this from here," she said. "We need the old backbone." The hatch had been sealed for 11 years, and it did not want to open. Mira worked the manual release with a strength born of pure adrenaline, Juno bracing the frame beside her, both of them working in the dark by the light of a single handheld lamp, while somewhere above and around them the station's failing gravity compensation made the corridor floor feel subtly, sickeningly unreliable beneath their boots. "Faster would be preferable," Juno said, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound calm and largely succeeding. "Working on it." The hatch gave with a shriek of protesting metal, and behind it, exactly where Mira remembered it, exactly where it had sat untouched and unloved for over a decade, the old analog backbone. Manual breaker banks. Physical override switches, each one hand labeled in a dozen different technicians' handwriting going back to the station's founding, none of it connected to Continuum at all, because it predated Continuum entirely, the bones of the station, the skeleton it had grown its new nervous system over without ever quite discarding. "This is what your species preserved," Juno said, staring at the wall of switches with an expression Mira could only describe as reverent. "Even after you no longer needed it." Especially after. Mira was already moving down the bank, reading labels by lamplight, feeling for the ones that mattered by a kind of muscle memory she hadn't known she still had. 8 years on the station, and underneath that, a whole childhood of storms and salvage and a mother who never once trusted a system she couldn't personally trace with her own hands. This is what my grandmother would call the honest version of the station. No prediction. Just wires and consequences. What do? We can't fix Continuum's model from here. It has to recover on its own once the environmental data stabilizes. But we can keep the station alive long enough for that to happen. Life support, gravity, structural integrity, the essentials. Manually. By feel. She looked at Juno, and made a decision she wasn't fully certain of, which was, she understood now with a strange, settling clarity, exactly the point. "I need someone to hold this bank steady while I work the sequence. If I get it wrong, we could lose gravity compensation across 3 decks at once. If we do nothing, we lose it anyway, just slower and worse. I have no training for this." Neither did I, 6 minutes ago. Nobody trains for the exact thing that's never happened before. You just act, and you watch closely enough to catch it if you're wrong. Juno stood very still for a moment, the stillest Mira had ever seen her, the stillness not of collective consensus but of a single mind, alone, choosing. Then she stepped forward and put both hands on the breaker bank frame. "Tell me what to do," she said. "I am with you." What followed was not elegant. It was not the smooth, silent competence of Continuum's ordinary operation. It was Mira calling out sequences half remembered from training manuals a decade out of date, Juno bracing and calling back readings from gauges that hadn't been checked by living eyes in years, both of them working by lamplight in a sealed, forgotten corridor while the station shuddered around them like something in pain. Twice, Mira got a sequence wrong, and the lurch of overcorrected gravity nearly threw them both against the wall. Twice, she recalibrated, adjusted, tried again, because stopping was not an option that existed anymore. 6 minutes in, the first breaker bank refused to hold a load Mira had routed to it, and the corridor light strobed violently before dying altogether, leaving only the lamp and the pale, faint glow of Juno's own skin, which Mira hadn't noticed before, brightening very slightly under stress the way the coral apparently did without meaning to. "That one's dead," Mira said, breathing hard. "We are rerouting again. 3rd bank from the left, the one marked in the old handwriting." "Which handwriting?" "There are several." "The one that looks angry." It did, too, tight, jagged letters, the hand of some long-departed technician who had clearly resented having to label anything at all. Juno found it in half the time Mira expected, hands already faster, already surer than they'd been 10 minutes before. Now what? Now we find out if I remember this part right. Mira set her jaw, and threw the switch. For one terrible half-second, nothing happened at all, and Mira had just long enough to consider, distantly, that she might have finally found the limit of what stubbornness and half-memory could accomplish, when the load caught, and held, and the corridor lights flickered back on, dimmer than before but steady. You remembered it right, Juno said, something in her voice that might, on a human, have been closer to or than relief. This time, Mira said. Don't get used to it. 20 minutes in, life support stabilized. 26 minutes in, a secondary alarm Mira hadn't accounted for began shrieking from a panel neither of them had touched, an oxygen mix warning from a section of the Ring 3 decks up, entirely unconnected to anything they were doing, and for one long, cold second Mira's mind went entirely blank, certain they'd broken something new rather than fixed anything old. Wait, Juno said, before Mira could reach for the panel. Look at the pattern. It is not falling. It is rising. She was right. The oxygen mix wasn't failing at all. It was recovering, faster than the old backbone's crude gauges were calibrated to expect, the alarm firing not because anything was wrong but because nothing in its threshold had ever accounted for improvement this abrupt. Mira silenced it with a hand that was not quite steady, and looked at Juno with something that might, under less exhausting circumstances, have been open astonishment. You caught that before I did. I have been watching you catch things for 9 days, Juno said. I am, apparently, capable of learning. 31 minutes in, gravity compensation, fed now through the old analog backbone rather than continuum silent, contradiction-locked core, settled into something rough but survivable across every deck of the station. 40 minutes in, far above them in a control room they couldn't see, continuum's environmental model, freed, finally, from the live feedback loop of contradictory sensor data as the storm's magnetic peak began, at last, to pass, recalculated, resolved, and came back online with a confidence interval that, for the first time in its 14 years of operation, it flagged internally as provisional. Mira sat down hard on the corridor floor, back against the old breaker bank, and laughed, not from joy, exactly, more from the particular exhaustion of having been right about something she'd had no way of proving in advance. Juno sat down beside her, slower, more careful, staring at her own hands in the lamplight as though she had never quite seen them before. I made a decision, she said quietly. Alone. Without consensus. Without certainty. How does it feel? Juno was quiet for a long time. Terrifying, she said finally. And also, mine. Entire la mine. I have never owned a decision before. Mira didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. She just sat there, in the dark, beside someone who had just discovered something about herself that no consensus model could ever have predicted for her, and let the quiet do the rest. The lights came back on the corridor by corridor, deck by deck, in the particular order continuum used when it was rebuilding trust in its own systems rather than simply resuming, cautious, sequential, checking each section before committing to the next. It was, Mira thought, watching it happen from the observation gallery 6 hours later, almost as if the station itself had learned something about moving carefully through uncertainty. Director Voss found her there, along with Juno, both of them still faintly singed with grime from the maintenance ring, neither of them having slept. He stood beside them for a long moment before speaking, watching Torvin Storms, smaller now, the great magnetic peak having passed as swiftly as it arrived, turned slow and orange below. The final assessment, he said, attributes the cascade failure to an unprecedented atmospheric magnetic interaction, outside any prior recorded baseline. Continuum's core models have been updated accordingly. Future occurrences of this magnitude should now fall within predictable parameters. Should, Mira said. Should, Voss agreed, and there was something almost rueful in the word, an admission he clearly hadn't expected to make. The treaty ratification has been postponed 3 days, to allow for a direct deliberative session among delegation leadership, rather than model projected consensus. Mira raised an eyebrow. That's a big change for a 3-day delay. It is, Voss said. Several delegations requested it, including my own. He paused. I confess I found the request uncomfortable to make. 14 years of trusting a system that has never required us to sit in a room and argue with each other directly. It felt, briefly, like a step backward. "It's not backward," Mira said. "It's just remembering there's a version of getting things right that doesn't need a model to hand it to you." Voss looked at her for a long moment, and something in his silver-grey face shifted. Not quite a smile, still, but closer to one than she'd ever seen from him. "The report on last night's incident will note that station personnel utilized emergency manual protocols to maintain critical systems during the model outage." A pause. "It will not adequately convey what that actually required. I am aware of this. I wanted to say so directly, since the report will not." "Thank you," Mira said, and meant it. He nodded once, and left them to the view, walking away down the gallery with a pace that, Mira noted, was very slightly less certain of everything than it had been a day before. She thought that might, in its own small way, be an improvement. Old Farron Cho found her not long after, polishing a handrail 2 sections down from where Voss had been standing, the same handrail he'd been polishing the morning of the anomaly, as though nothing in the intervening days had touched him at all. "Heard you crawled through the old backbone," he said, not looking up. "Word travels. Word always travels. Question is whether anyone actually listens to it." He finished the rail, straightened, and looked at her properly for the first time. 14 years I watched people forget that hatch existed. Some of them helped seal it themselves and forgot by the following year. You didn't forget." "Guess not." "Guess not," Farron agreed, and there was something almost like pride in it, an old man's pride in a habit he recognized because he'd carried a version of it himself, quietly, for longer than anyone had bothered to notice. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his cloth, moved 3 meters down the corridor, and started on the next handrail, exactly the way he had the morning before the storm, exactly the way, Mira suspected, he'd go on doing long after everyone else had stopped thinking about what had happened in Sector 12 at all. Juno stayed a while longer. "I have requested reassignment," she said eventually, looking out at Torvin rather than at Mira. "Not away from this station. Away from provisional status. I have asked to remain unlinked from full consensus voting, for now. To learn to hold my own decisions a while longer before I fold them back into the hole." "That's a big ask for your people." "It is unprecedented," Juno said, and there was something almost wry in how she said it, an echo of Mira's own voice from days before. "Yet." Mira laughed, surprised again, the same way she'd been surprised the first time. "Yet," she agreed. They stood together at the viewport as Meridian Station settled, deck by deck, back into its ordinary rhythm. Continuum's dashboards filling once more with green, confident numbers, the whole enormous, patient machinery of the place resuming its usual quiet certainty. Except that now, somewhere in its core, sat a small, permanent flag, a note that certainty had limits, and that beneath the model, still and always, sat the honest version of the station, the wires, the switches, the hands that knew how to find them in the dark. The next morning, Mira walked her usual round through Sector 12, sensor in hand, checking a coolant line that had, by every reading, returned entirely to normal. She wasn't alone this time. Juno walked beside her, watching everything, asking careful questions, occasionally reaching out to touch a fitting or a gauge the way you might touch something you were only just learning to trust with your own hands rather than borrowing someone else's certainty about it. Nobody stopped them to ask why. Nobody called it charming, or quaint, or unnecessary. By the time anyone aboard Meridian Station had fully understood what those manual inspections were actually for, they had already needed them. That, Mira thought, walking the quiet corridor in the pale gold light of an ordinary morning, was probably always going to be how it went. You didn't get to prove the backup mattered until the day the whole system needed one. You just had to be the kind of people who kept one anyway. 3 days later, when the delegations finally gathered in person around a physical table for the first time in the station's history to argue the treaty out face to face rather than let a model hand it to them fully formed, Mira wasn't in the room. She had no reason to be. It wasn't her negotiation, and nobody had asked for her opinion on tariffs or border resource shares, and she wouldn't have had much to offer if they had. But she thought, walking her round that morning, about what Juno had told her the evening before, that the deliberation had been slow and clumsy, and full of the kind of disagreement Continuum had spent 14 years quietly smoothing out of existence, and that halfway through the second hour, when 2 delegations had reached an impasse neither side's model would ever have predicted, it was a junior coral observer, newly unlinked from full consensus, who had suggested a compromise nobody's projection had ever contained. It hadn't been elegant. It hadn't been certain. It had, by every account Mira heard afterward, very nearly failed twice before it worked. It had worked anyway. She thought that was probably, in the end, the only kind of proof that mattered.